really healing your attachment style, it's partially about finding secure relationships where you're always having what's called corrective experiences. Do the thing that you're most afraid of based on your attachment style, because if you never actually do that thing, that assumption that you have from your childhood becomes the truth until
Yeah.
you're able to create a new truth.
If you're a regular listener of Love, Happiness, and Success, you know that routinely we are digging deep into the messy, beautiful, or sometimes tricky world of relationships. And on today's episode, we're diving into one of the most challenging aspects of relationships that many of us encounter, which is related to very difficult friendships. What do you do when a friendship isn't feeling good for you anymore, or maybe even turning toxic? Joining me for this conversation is Dr. Marissa Franco. She is a psychologist and best-selling author of Platonic, and she's here to help us navigate these murky waters of difficult friendships. How do you spot the warning signs of a friendship that's going sideways? Can toxic relationships be saved? And when is it time to cut ties with a friendship that may have run its course? If you have ever wondered how to handle these complicated connections, you are in the right place. And Dr. Marissa, thank you so much for joining me for today's conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Let's talk a little bit about your work first, because you are a psychologist and you have done a ton of work, research, writing on the subject of friendships, but interestingly, through an attachment lens. So, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your work in general?
Sure. Yeah. I wrote the book Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep
Hmm.
Friends. And I basically took attachment theory, which is this idea that from our early relationships, we develop this template of how we think people are responding to us.
Mm.
And because social relationships are so ambiguous, we rely on our preconceived assumptions more than what is actually happening. So it's even if I reach out to a friend and they say, I'm so happy to hear from you. If I'm anxious, I might think they're just saying that. That's not what they really mean, right? I'll use my own set of assumptions from my past experiences to figure out what the truth is. And so there's different attachment styles based off of our earlier experiences that we develop, different assumptions about how other people will treat us. And these tend to become somewhat of self fulfilling prophecies, such as if you think people are going to abandon you, then you withdraw and then people actually abandon you, right? And so I think the power of understanding attachment theory is that if you don't understand it, you think, oh, people in the world are just going to abandon you, or people in the world are just going to shame you or harm you. You just can't trust people. And if you understand attachment theory, you realize that assumption is actually leading to a set of behaviors that I'm displaying that makes me more likely to reach that outcome. And that's empowering because then I can actually change my behaviors in my friendships and find a different outcome than the assumption that I'm coming in with.
That is so cool. I just love hearing you say this out loud, that we all have these mental filters through which we view the world that really colors our experiences, our expectations, and then, of course, influences the way that we operate in our relationships. And I'm just so happy that we're talking about this, because so often, and in my domain, I don't know if you know this, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and so I specialize in couples counseling. And we talk so often about attachment styles in romantic relationships, but not so much in friendships, and they are absolutely needing to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, your attachment style affects every part of how you form friends, from whether you initiate to how you handle conflict to how you handle endings.
Mhm.
All of those are predicted by your attachment style.
Wow. Okay, so then let's talk about this. When it comes to friendships, and particularly ones that feel challenging, particularly if perhaps we have patterns of getting ourselves involved with friends that maybe aren't that healthy for us, how would you say our attachment styles influence the types of friendships either that we attract or maintain when it comes to these toxic relationships?
Yeah, so there's this theory called self verification theory, which is the
Mm.
idea that we look for relationships that verify our sense of self. So if you see people that have low self esteem, they actually report preferring to interact with people that treat them more negatively. Because if someone
Hmm.
treats them positively, they think they're going to find out who I really am. There's all this anticipation anxiety, the sense of imposter syndrome. They don't really know me. They don't get me because they see me so positively. I'm just going to let them down and disappoint them. And so there's this way that if we have low self esteem, which I would say is anxiously attached people, that's the attachment style that tends to be most related to lower self esteem, that we tend to shy away from people that treat us positively and
Hmm.
look for people that make us earn love, which is really what we learned in our primary relationship, that our parent would only be available if we forced them into it, if we cried, if we made a scene, finally we would get their attention. And so if you're anxiously attached, you may find yourself being drawn to people that don't actually like you very much. And so one
Hmm.
tip that I have, for example, for anxiously attached people is that if someone doesn't seem to like you, walk away, don't work harder, because the anxious
Yeah.
person is, you don't like me, challenge accepted.
I will make you love me. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. So, this is super interesting. And before we move on, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, and if it's okay, and certainly wanting to be very respectful of everybody's confidentiality, but perhaps there are some examples that you've written about in your book around what this looks like that you've seen in people, clients, or people that you've researched, where the early life experiences and their family of origin and those first relationships echo into their platonic friendships later in life. You gave a great example of what an anxiously attached person might show up as, almost preferring somebody, mistreats them. But what would you say about an avoidantly attached person? And also, how does this compare to a securely attached person? The life
Yeah.
experiences that shape it and what it looks like in the wild.
Yeah. So the avoidantly attached person tends to initiate less friendships, puts
Mm.
less effort into them, more likely to end their friendships, more likely to ghost. So basically, their friendships are low reward. They're low effort and low reward.
Mm.
And that's because they've learned that intimacy is scary, that it's going to be uncomfortable, threatening, that they're going to be harmed. And really, the avoidant person's caretaker was not there for them emotionally. Maybe
Yeah.
they had, food on the table, they had basic resources, clothes, but emotionally they were shut down by their parent. It was the parent that says, "Stop crying or I'm going to give you something to cry about," or "I'm going to ignore you until you can get yourself together and compose yourself," right? And actually, when John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, he says we get anxious before we get avoidant. First, what the baby will do is cry and try and try. And eventually, when they learn that they're not going to get their needs met, when a baby can't be soothed, they literally alter their consciousness.
Mm.
And they basically pretend that they're not in distress, even when they are. And that's what we see avoidant people doing, because avoidant people will talk about an upsetting experience and be like, "And I'm fine, and I'm strong, and I'm better because of it." But physiologically, their heart rate is rising, they're sweating. Like, you can still see this way that their personality is split between what they're saying and what their body's actually going through.
Mm.
And so, because of this fear of intimacy, avoidantly attached people, low vulnerability in their friendships, not able to work through conflict, feel very easily shamed if you give them any feedback, will withdraw, won't really work through things, talk it out. And they tend to expect more from others, but don't try as hard themselves. They'll be very easy to say that this person has slighted me, but won't necessarily think about how their own behaviors, the lack of vulnerability, the withdrawal of affection, are affecting other people. And then you have securely attached people. And what the securely attached person has learned is that when I'm upset, someone will take care of me, someone will comfort me, someone will be there for me. And so in their friendships, they know that they've internalized the sense that someone is always there for them. And so they feel very confident taking the risks of friendship. They're more likely to initiate friendships, more likely to be vulnerable, but importantly, differently than the anxiously attached person, they adjust their vulnerability based on the other person's reciprocity. Again,
Mm.
the anxious person sees, "You're not vulnerable with me. Now let me overshare more to try to bring you in and get you to like me." That's a sign that the secure person is really just living in the present moment more. They're discerning based on the person in front of them instead of applying their template from the past. With this anxious person, they're going to abandon me. They're abandoning me. This is a sign they're abandoning me. The avoidant person, they're going to harm me. I can't trust them. I have to keep them far away, no matter what the other person's qualities actually are in front of you. And so the secure person has the ability to be discerning. They will bring up issues without attacking the other person. They're
Mhm.
great at perspective taking. They have more empathy. Like they're not trying to get their needs met at the expense of yours. They're also not trying to overly accommodate like an anxiously person attached person might for the other person. So they just tend to be fair, they tend to be kinder, they tend to be more generous in friendships. Overall, just really good at making friends.
Yeah. And would think that they, because of that, they have better experiences with their friends as a general rule.
Yeah. Also, I think if a secure person, for example, came across an avoidant person who wasn't reaching out, who wasn't really vulnerable, who never affirmed them, they would be like, I'm going to find someone else who makes me feel better in this relationship. Whereas the
Yeah.
anxious person is like, it's me, it's my fault. I have to get them to like me. And so not only are secure people more secure themselves, but they're also more drawn to other people that are also secure.
Wow. Okay, so for anybody listening to this and having flashes of recognition, can we also just say though that you and I, Dr. Marissa, both know from counseling school, like the very first experience with the DSM, it is very easy to hear about other things and think, oh, that's me. And like really profound, lifelong attachment styles. Like there's a lot to that. And so I just want to caution the listener from going in too deep around pathologizing themselves. But also it is true that we all have a range of early life experiences with our caregivers that do shape us. And so there may be moments of recognition as you're hearing Dr. Marissa talk about different attachment styles that could be very real for you, and thinking about your own friendships and how those have played out, and perhaps even getting some new insight into how your attachment style may be co-creating the experiences that you're having. And Dr. Marissa, is there anything that you would be willing to share for our listeners about just some ways to, with this self-awareness, start making some simple positive changes that improve the quality of relationships?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I tell people in Platonic about making friends, that is
Mm.
something I got from seeing how secure people make friends, is to try to assume that people will like you. Going in, trying to make that assumption. And I know it's not easy, particularly if your attachment styles are telling you they're going to abandon me, they're going to harm me. And so I think an important question we can ask ourselves if we're insecurely attached is, what if I don't perceive this through the lens of my triggers or through the
Mm.
lens of my insecurities? Then how might I perceive this event? How might I perceive the situation? And so it's developing, I think, that we call it in like the psychology world, like you're standing on a balcony
Yeah.
looking at the situation almost as a third party, rather than being the person in the backyard fighting through it with another person. And so sometimes that looks like getting consensus with other your more secure friends as well. But I think really scaling your attachment style, it's partially about finding secure relationships where you're always having what's called corrective experiences, where people are, let's say for the avoidant person, they're vulnerable and someone loves them for it and feels closer to them. Or the anxious person is scared of abandonment and doesn't want to ask for a need, but they do, and the other person's so happy to hear it. And so when you look at the research over time, like longitudinally, what makes anxious people more secure over time, it's these corrective experiences. And
Mm.
for anxiously attached people, that looks like developing a sense of independence, because you have learned that you have to hyper focus on your relationships to get love, that you've lost touch with your sense of self. And it's like only your relationships can regulate your emotions, and you can't regulate them on your own.
Yeah.
And so, what interests are you wanting to pursue outside of relationships that are important to you? Like almost unhooking yourself. You're
Right.
coming up too close in your relationships. Whereas when you look at avoidant people, and studies look at what makes avoidant people over time, less avoidant over time, it's the exact opposite, because their problem is the exact opposite. They're keeping too much distance from people. And so
Mm.
when avoidant people start depending on people more over time, and they get those corrective experiences where nobody shames them, no one makes them feel bad, then you find that avoidant people become more secure over time. So it's do the thing that you're most afraid of based on your attachment style, because if you never actually do that thing, that assumption that you have from your childhood becomes the truth until
Yeah.
you're able to create a new truth.
Absolutely. I love this. I think about this often and talk about this often on my show. And I'm so glad you are saying this again. I think, particularly in this day and age, there are so many people that are spouting off advice and tips and what to do. And you're reminding us that this type of growth work, it's not informational, it is experiential. It is putting yourself out there, being in the ring, having corrective emotional experiences over time that actually transforms you in the direction that you want to go in. So thank you for saying that out loud on behalf of our listeners. So, this has been fantastic. In this first chapter, we've been talking about how the science of attachment informs our friendships and potentially co-creates situations where we're having maybe negative friendship experiences or toxic relationships. And I love your message about how we do actually have more control over the experiences that we have by working on ourselves and our own attachment issues. And so, in this next segment, I'd like to pivot into talking about situations where maybe is a little bit different. Perhaps somebody has become involved with someone that they determine is toxic, and maybe they don't want to continue the friendship anymore, but they're having trouble separating themselves. So, thank you everyone for listening to this first video with me, Dr. Marissa, and I hope you click on the next one to continue this conversation and get Dr. Marissa's good advice about how to start setting some boundaries with people that you've determined you do not want to stay connected with.